what you've got to understand is just like racism was necessary to allow for the African slave trade to happen, to allow imperialism in China or in India. Capitalism needs racism to allow it to rape the planet, and it still needs it. That's the bottom line. Because if we actually decided as a country that we were going to get rid of it, I'm not saying we could get rid of it totally, by the way, but we could get rid of it very quickly and very effectively.
Welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan, and every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first 30 minutes here on YouTube and the full episode on Patreon for members to watch in full for free. So just please become a patron on Patreon. We're just trying to diversify our platforms just in case anything happens to this YouTube channel. And also, if you want to make a donation, just know that it will just go to covering our costs. So this week, I have a very special guest, Jacqueline Walker. Jackie is a British and American political activist, educator, and author of African and Sephardi Jewish heritage. She has worked as a teacher and anti-racism trainer and served as vice chair of South Thanet Constituency Labour Party and vice chair of Momentum before being suspended and ultimately expelled from the Labour Party over contested allegations of antisemitism. She is the author of Pilgrim State, a family memoir exploring race, mental health, and resilience, and The Lynching, a political memoir and one-woman show confronting racism, censorship, and the weaponization of anti-Semitism on the British left. Whoa, sorry, that was a pretty long intro, but we want to get everybody on board for, who you are. A lot of people do actually know who you are, but a lot of our international viewers maybe might be new to you. But welcome, Jackie, to Global Majority for Peace.
Thank you. And by the way, all of those things that I've done are actually much more fun than they sound, because that's one of the ways that I work politically, is I think you communicate best through narrative and through engaging people. And you engage people by making people feel good and happy while not hiding from them what's actually happening either.
Oh, I love that. I mean, also, I have your book, Pilgrim State, here. There were two covers. I chose this one, but I'm not sure how you feel about that. I think it's very beautiful. So there's this one, and I think also having a one-woman show, like you're saying, it's just that empathy and connection in a different way. I love that concept that you're saying. But we do like to begin every interview on a little bit of a personal note. Could we start with you telling us about your origin of your politicization? Was there a particular incident that has led you to your worldview?
Yeah, it was probably my parents coming together, actually, because, I often say to people, I think I was in a way genetically made to be a political activist, because my father was a Jewish communist in America. My mother was a Black activist, civil rights activist. This is in the 1950s, by the way. So you're talking about the height of McCarthyism. So their relationship was already illicit in so many ways. They were crossing, the color bar. They were crossing the political boundaries. So their whole relationship and my conception was actually, in a way, a political, as well as one hopes, a pleasurable act. as well, So in a way, it's hard to get away from that heritage. That's who I was. And then we went to Jamaica, which was actually a very different place. In fact, my mother was deported from America for un-American activities. And she was obviously involved in some deep stuff because when I went to try and get my files access, freedom of information from the US, they kept some back. They kept 5 files back, and they said it was for national security reasons. Now, that's extraordinary if you think, that you're talking about decades later. So I think you've got to put that whole thing into the bag of who I am. And then you've got to understand that I then have this experience of migration and dislocation and of the shock that that encounters. We went on from there to go via Canada to the UK on a boat, part of that Windrush generation of people from the Caribbean who entered the United Kingdom supposedly under British passports, because that's what we thought we were, only to be faced not only with dreadful weather, but really, really violent racism. And when I'm talking about violent racism, I'm not talking about being called names. I'm talking about having firebombs repeatedly put through our letterbox, of having our windows broken so often that we had to live under boarded up windows. Now, that in itself is a political education, because as a child, you think to yourself, why am I having to run home? Because adults, I'm not talking about children here, but adults might beat me up because of the color of my skin. And if you've got any sort of sense of who you are and what you are, that is going to make you think. At that point, my mother then died when I was 11, so I went into children's homes. So different forms of poverty and oppression. And that also taught me a lot, because the people that you're in children's homes with, many of them are in much worse circumstances than I was in. I mean, at least I had a mother who desperately loved me and who gave me the kind of, if you like, emotional safeguards that got me through some horrific abuse. Actually, I don't put most of that abuse in the book because I didn't want it to be that kind of memoir. But, even by the time I was 11, when my mother died, I'd already been to protests, civil rights protests in the UK. I'd been to the American embassy protesting the assassination of Kennedy. And then later on, it was also followed by that range of assassinations that took out people like Martin Luther King. And then if you go back in my whole family history, these acts of resistance have been going on, so I discovered when I started to do research into my family, literally for generations, going right back into the time of enslavement, where my ancestors were part of that sort of rebellion. So I can't remember a time when politics wasn't part of what we spoke about, because it had formed our lives. I hope that's a reasonable sort of exposition of, what's made me the aware, sort of complicated worldview person that I am.
Yeah, no, that's really a wonderful snippet, I guess, like a little view into what formed you, your identity. It's actually very fascinating, even more so. I think personally you might have more books in you. I would
Yeah,
hope anyway, because
yeah.
this is beautifully written. But we'll get into that later. For our second question, I wanted to talk about the current news that is dominating headlines at the moment. In July of this year, to get everyone up to speed, Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn announced the formation of a new left-wing party, tentatively and temporarily called Your Party. 2 months on, Team Corbyn has allegedly reported Sultana to the Information Commissioner, and Zara announced that she has instructed specialist defamation lawyers. This implosion was perhaps a little more dramatic than expected, yet the issues were evident from the beginning, in my opinion. Can you help us unpack what this means for the left movement in the UK, particularly with the imminent rise of reform? And also, what are your thoughts on the new development of our party, something that was just announced very recently? In your opinion, what would be a few guidelines they could implement to build something sustainable? And also, sorry, this is like so many questions in one, but do you think the new Green Party headed by Zach Polanski, what do you think about that? Does that hold more promise? What are your thoughts?
Okay, so I'm going to sort of have to try and remember that series of questions quite a bit. But just to start with, I think, it's really interesting because it has both a global and a national relevance. Because I think the state of the left in the UK is resonant with what's happening in the United States and with what's happening in Europe and the rest of the world. Because what you have, and there's no doubt about this, nobody's going to deny this, is a rise of far-right nationalism. And we see that in what I call Euro America. We see that across Euro America. And it is vicious, and it is violent, and it is deeply dishonest. I'm not going to pull my punches about what I think about what's going on. And so the need for an effective opposition to that has never, ever been more. Now, I say that because if you remember, if I go back to what I was just saying, when I first came to the UK in 1959, there was real violent racism going on. I mean, without a doubt. And it was everyday racism, and it was in your face racism. And many of us thought, as anti-racists, as activists, as people working in the formal and informal sectors, we thought we had done much to lessen that. But actually, it raises its head again. And so the question becomes, why does it raise its head again? And I'm not going to go into that here. It's far too big a topic. But let's just point towards what's been happening in the economy as a starter and what's been happening internationally. So you have these two things going on, which is that nationally, you have people whose standard of living in this country has actually gone down. And it hasn't just gone down over a couple of years, it's gone on for 10, 15, maybe more years. People's standard of living have, and this is a real decline in standard of living. At the same time, where the state, so the kind of safety net which the British state can offer you, has been gradually and sometimes less gradually whipped away from people. So we have to be clear that there is probably around a third of people in this country who are living pretty awful, grindingly awful lives where they're often sending their kids to school hungry. And that, as we all know, is a fertile bed for the rise of nationalism and pointing the finger. And then if you look at what's been happening internationally, we have the fact that Euro America has been either funding or encouraging or waging global conflict now. For how long? Do you know what? I can't even remember how long. It gets like that. It's such a long time. And I remember when I was working in global education, which was probably something around 30 or 40 years now, and we were warning two things were going to cause mass migration. One thing was global warming, obviously, but the second thing was war. It's like really simple. If you bomb people and you make their lives impossible. By the way, I reject this term, economic migrants. If you can't get enough food because there's a war going on, not even near you, but somewhere around you, if you can't get enough food because there's global warming and the powers that be haven't got it in them to actually make sure that you're provided for in a reasonably way. Like an economic not migrant is kind of seen as somebody who kind of buys a season ticket and just says, oh, I think I'd like to go to England. No, migrancy is really hard work. It's awful. It's stressful. You lose a lot, you know. So this is the world we have. So, of course, what we also know is, particularly with COVID in the UK and in other countries, but I'm being specific on the UK, what happened was the redistribution of wealth, which had been going for a long time from poor to rich, really accelerated. And the gap between rich and poor has widened. So, if you're a multi-billionaire and you own TikTok and you own, you know, the mass media, and you own television and you own the films and you own politicians, let's be frank about what's happening here. Who are you going to blame? You're not going to point the finger at the people who are making the arms because you're profiting from that. You're not going to point your finger at the rich people who aren't paying their taxes because you're doing very well. And you point the finger at migrants. And so what we have is a perfect storm. And then, of course, you have that going on with Trump, and it's perfection, isn't it? Both sides of the Atlantic. The UK as a puppet American colony goes yap, yap, yap to Trump. I mean, today I got on a bus and there was this obviously not very well off man with his dog, must have been in his 80s or 90s, and he was wearing a Make America Great Again hat. And at the same time, he had a red poppy in his lapel. So here he is, commemorating those who died to fight the fascists, right? And there he is with a hat on, glorifying the proto-fascism we see growing. And that says it all, I think. So that's what we're faced with on the left. But of course, Corbyn, and I don't like to put it as one person really, but the Corbyn movement had its shot when Jeremy Corbyn was elected as leader of the Labour Party. And to be frank, they were undermined by, I think, things we're going to come on to speak about in a bit. And it wasn't just by chance either that they were undermined. But even with the media, the establishment, everything against us, the left, we almost did it. If you look at how many actual votes we got, we were a few thousand because of our electoral system and how it works. We were literally a few thousand away from gaining power. Now, rerun that again, and here we are faced with this other, suddenly the world is burning around us, right? And we're offered the potential of another chance. And that has what's happened. And that's why so many people are so distressed to see what's happened between Corbyn and Sultana, the putative leaders of this left.
Yeah, I think it's really astonishing. I didn't actually know the statistics that you were saying about we were a few thousand off in terms of winning, because the idea from then to now, the possibility of us growing that movement should have been there, but it was completely failed by many forces, which we'll talk about in a bit. But what are your thoughts about this idea of this Our Party group coming out? You know, I guess the idea of a section of your party has sort of come out and said that they are going to try to bring it back to the people without the polarizing, I guess, clashing of Jeremy and Zara. What do you think of the viability of that? And is there a way in which they could do it? Are there some guidelines or some things that they could do that could make it actually sustainable?
I mean, the sad thing about it is, I think there's a lot that could be done. Our party, your party, it's like, oh, guys, at the moment, the way I feel about it is I don't know who's behind any of these groupings, right? That automatically makes me feel like I'm not quite sure about who to believe and what to believe. And I'm sure there are many people who are actually agreeing with me as well. So that's the first thing. I mean, if you ask me what could be happening at the moment, and there is some discussion that there is conversations now going on. And just last night, there was a post made by Zara Sultana where she was obviously reaching out to the Corbyn grouping, saying we need to get together, let's try and see what we can do about this. It doesn't feel to me very clear that the Corbyn party people have actually reciprocated on that in any way, in any real way, although there do seems to be conversations going on. Now, this is all about how you handle democracy, how you handle democracy even at the point before you've established a party. Because if you have five MPs, and then you have Zara Sultana, and they have to vote on what's happening, and the five MPs who, by the way, and I do think it's relevant that they're all male. I do, and I know I'm going to be shot down for that, but I'm going to say it. If you've got that going on, and you know that that grouping of independent MPs, that means the kind of four independent MPs and Corbyn, are always pretty much going to vote together, then you haven't got a democratic start. So you can't say, look at what Zara Sultana did. She lost the vote on this. Of course, she lost the vote on it. That's not how you're going to work this. And Zara Sultana represents a very significant part of the left. Now, you could say, yeah, but it's Corbyn who's got the main line here. He's the one who's got name recognition. And of course, that's where his power lies. But I would suggest to you, and I've got no proof to this except anecdotal proof, I think what Zara Sultana has is the support of most activists, i.e., that most people in the know, most people who are keeping in touch and have kept in touch for the last 10 or so, 5 years with what's going on, are in much more sympathetic to what's happening with Zara. And now, if you ask me what I think should happen, I think you should have both parties or both camps, shall we say, able to nominate, say, five people each who they feel are independent, who wouldn't then be allowed to take up any office within the new party for at least, say, a year or 2 years. And they would come together and actually they would be the ones to work this stuff out. Because it's almost like, I did say this to somebody and they laughed. As somebody who's been through a divorce a number of times, it's almost like when people get into a divorce. You need a cool off time. You need people to cool down before they can really come together and talk together. But you need to do that under some kind of equal leveling, and that they would be the people who would then negotiate us into the next stage of what's happening. That's what I would suggest would be the next step forward. But to push ahead, I heard Jeremy Corbyn, I think it was yesterday when he was at his Peace and Justice conference, saying, oh, there's nothing changed. We're just simply going to go ahead with plans as has already been set out. It just made me go, what? Are you not listening to this? That's apart from the fact that I am hugely critical of the plans for the founding conference that have already been put out.
Oh, I have not seen the plans that have.
Okay, so let me just take a few of the things that I think are problematic. So you've got 800,000 signed up people. These are not people who have yet paid any money in, but they're signed up. That's a vast number of people. And that has its pros and cons, of course. This has never been attempted before. So what they're proposing is that all of those people who are signed up have a choice of, I think it's 4 different sorts of constitutional models that have already been written, and everybody gets a chance to edit them. And then somebody, I don't know, maybe Moses or God or I don't know who, decides what the final thing is going to be, and it's voted on. Right? So I've got huge queries about that. And the other thing is that for the actual founding conference, we won't have delegates as is normally known. So you won't go to your local group, hear people talk, have a discussion, and then vote for a delegate. No, no, no. People will be chosen by raffle. So these are people who might never have been to a meeting, who don't know who they're supposed to represent, who nobody knows of, who will go to this delegate conference to do the voting on the founding of the party. Now, this is the kind of model that's used in Just Stop Oil and kind of single issue protest groups. And it works there because it's one issue. Everybody's agreed on the issue. Stop oil. That's the issue, right? But there's nothing more to, that's not the same as a political party. And of course, what that does is depoliticizes the membership totally. And it enables the people at the top to have even more control than they did in the Labour Party. So if you're asking me about what's going on in terms of democracy, in terms of this as an idea, I think it's very worrying indeed.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.